Like the civilian guinea pigs, we, including military personnel and civilian test site workers and downwinders, were the subjects of biomedical experiments, should call them homicidal experiments, to see how we would be affected by ionizing radiation under every conceivable aspect of military service in war and peace. We were a captive population like the group of prisoners who were deliberately exposed to gamma radiation to determine how much it would take to make them sterile. In the consent form, they had to agree to have vasectomies because of possible damage to their chromosomes. Then there were the Fresnel children who were fed Quaker oats, laced or flavored with radiation, take your pick. What about the radiation experiments on the pregnant women at Vanderbilt University Hospital, or the 18 innocents, including Mrs. Bell's father, who were injected with plutonium without their knowledgeable consent, or the children who were experimented upon by NASA at Oak Ridge, or the children of the downwinders who were badged to see how much radiation they were exposed to, or the children of the Los Alamos scientists we learned about at the last conference, and the thousands of military personnel, male and female, who were stationed at Camp Hanford to guard the plutonium production facilities. As for the military personnel at the Pacific and Nevada Proving Ground, some were badged, but most were not. Even staff at Warren's so-called radiation safety monitors were experimental subjects. Some of the men claimed that when some of the test participants, not particularly the safety monitors, claimed that when they went to sick bay after the test to complain about illnesses, their illnesses were deliberately misdiagnosed as conventional ones, just as the DOD is doing about the Persian Gulf illnesses, and some of them were given quickie medical discharges. How many men may have been court-martialed or otherwise punished for refusing to be exposed to radiation during the atomic bomb testing? Probably not many, because not many knew what the real dangers were. Why were so many medical records lost, quote unquote? Why were so many young men sent on temporary duty assignments, TDY, to be guinea pigs in atomic bomb tests, and why were their assignments deliberately left out of their service records so that when they filed claims they would be denied for lack of proof of participation? Why did the military and nuclear power industries adopt a threshold of harmless exposure below a certain specified amount of radiation? Again, what Dr. Sternglass was talking about, the linear principle and so on. Why did they also accept the linear hypothesis whereby the more the radiation one was exposed to, the more harm would result, as a strategy to deny the insidious long-range effect of low-level ionizing radiation? Why was Stafford Warren concerned about the large number of lawsuits that might occur? Why was the Defense Nuclear Agency created? Was it to help the veterans obtain justice or to prevent them from obtaining justice? Why were less than adequate radiation compensation laws passed? Why were so many competent scientists, like Dr. Sternglass, drummed out of government or denied funding for their legitimate research or prevented from publishing their findings when they sought to tell the truth? Why is the veteran's only recourse for justice the VA? Why can't he sue his government for damages? Why is he denied his constitutional rights of due process? It's because of a Supreme Court decision reached just after World War II called the Ferris Doctrine, when a serviceman tried to sue the government for injuries he suffered while in the service, and he was turned down because of the principle of sovereign immunity for the government, which immunizes it against suits by servicemen. Why was the Price-Anderson Act passed in 1957 to protect the utility companies from full financial liability for nuclear disasters? Why was the Warner Amendment enacted to immunize government contractors involved in the nuclear bomb testing from being sued by injured servicemen? My overriding concern, already mentioned before this committee by Cooper Brown, Cliff Honecker, Pat Brody, and others, is that this committee's findings may fall short of producing the evidence that will support the claims of the thousands of atomic veterans who believe that they were experimental subjects in the same context as all the other subjects who were injected with radioactive substances in order to prepare this country for nuclear warfare. It is clear that every test was designed to test the succession of nuclear devices and the military personnel involved. I'll give you an example. After Operation Crossroads, it was determined that on the ships, the target ships, that objects that were painted lighter in color showed less radioactivity than objects that were painted darker in color. I happened to meet a Navy veteran of Operation Hardtack 1 when I lived back in Pennsylvania, and he had served on the USS Boxer as an enlisted man in Operation Hardtack 1. And he told me that in preparation for one of the bomb tests, the enlisted men of the Boxer were told to line up on the flight deck and cover themselves with their mattress covers, which were white, and turn their backs in the direction of the detonation, and while the officers were in the enclosed bridge. This is what he told me, and he said that when the bomb went off, they could feel the heat, the blast, see the bones in their arms, and he said that not long after that, his hair began to fall out. He was only 18. When he went aboard the Boxer, he had a full head of bright, flaming red hair. His hair fell out, then his teeth began to fall out, and now he frequently has cysts on his body that have to be removed. And we hear this constantly from veterans, the same story about the teeth, the hair, and the cysts. And how would they be affected during the short run, because the nuclear war was not expected to last very long? National survival was the compelling reason for these tests, according to the test planners. J. Robert Oppenheimer, when he learned that post-war nuclear bomb tests were being planned, he insisted that the testing could be done with models and could be done theoretically, but he was overridden. Long wars were a thing of the past. The Gulf War is a case in point. If even one of the cruise missiles used was nuclear tipped, how long would that war have lasted, and what would the human damage have been? Why isn't the veteran given the benefit of the doubt when his claim is being adjudicated as the law stipulates? It says this in the laws, but he's not given the benefit of the doubt. Speaking of the Gulf War, did any of you watch 60 Minutes last Sunday when Ed Bradley presented all kinds of evidence, including witnesses, that poisonous chemicals were used by Iraq during the war, and that many of our personnel became very ill, that because became very ill as a result of their exposure. And John Deutsch, who's the Assistant Secretary of Defense now, and who is the appointee designate to head the CIA, persistently denied that any of the illnesses were caused by chemical agents to which the servicemen and women might have been exposed during the Gulf War. And I've heard too much testimony to the contrary, and I was also both disappointed and shocked that the use of depleted uranium during the Gulf War was not mentioned even once. And I've heard testimony at a conference that I went to in Jonesboro, Tennessee, a few months ago, by participants who claimed that their health was seriously impaired by depleted uranium. And so that I was very disappointed in that 60 Minutes presentation, but I was not surprised to hear the testimony of John Deutsch. And he was obviously lying, and when he was the provost of MIT, one of his jobs was to get as much money from the Pentagon as possible to finance MIT defense research. He also happened to be on the executive board of SAIC, the Science Applications International Corporation Incorporated, which is a contractor for the Defense Nuclear Agency to provide dosage reconstructions, which are invariably low and used by the VA to shoot down veterans' claims. This committee has determined that all of the nuclear bomb test series in the Pacific and Nevada, only Operation Red Wing was experimental because the military aircraft that were flown through the mushroom clouds were not equipped with the filters used to collect air samples. If they were equipped with filters, I suppose their missions would not have been regarded as experimental. As of this moment, this is when I wrote this, to the best of my knowledge, none of the other tests have been deemed experimental by this committee. I hope this will change. Well, as I pointed out at the beginning of my talk, it does seem to be changing because of what you came up with on Buster Jangle. Further, the committee relied exclusively on governmental sources instead of their own faculties to reach this conclusion, considering all the information available about these tests, which is now apparently being rectified. Can you imagine the uproar that would ensue when participants in the other test series learned that the tests they were in were not considered experimental. Well, as I pointed out at the beginning of my talk, it does seem to be changing because of what you came up with on Buster Jangle. Further, the committee relied exclusively on governmental sources instead of their own faculties to reach this conclusion, considering all the information available about these tests, which is now apparently being rectified. Can you imagine the uproar that would ensue when participants in the other test series learned that the tests they were in were not considered experimental? Well, now you've opened a Pandora's box by coming up with the evidence about Red Wing. So documentary material that is in our favor. Documentary material has been presented to this committee stating that urine samples were to be obtained from all the test participants, which of course were not obtained from the vast majority of the test participants. Why are urine samples taken? Are they taken to see how much radiation remains in the body? Are they taken to determine how the ingested radiation affects the subject's health? We think the urine samples, if they are taken, have been taken, were to determine that how little was left in the body, despite the damage what was excreted previously caused. I was a test participant in Operation Crossroads at Bikini in July 1946. One of my crewmates recently informed me, I hadn't seen him for years, recently informed me that he was told not to look at the atomic detonation because he might suffer serious radiation injury. I'm talking about Test Able, the bomb that shows on the cover of this newsletter. I, on the contrary, recall being out on the deck of the same vessel, a floating dry dock, which had been towed to a presumably safe distance when it was announced over the PA system that if we wanted to see the detonation of Test Able, we should look in a certain direction and listen to the countdown over the PA system. We were not issued protective goggles, even though I later learned that a special directive to that effect had been issued to all the ships assigned to the test. When the countdown reached 0, I saw the flash on the horizon, and we immediately reversed course and headed back to Bikini. We entered the lagoon the next morning, anchored, and proceeded to work on damaged target ships. As before the test, when work was over, we stripped down and dove into the contaminated lagoon for our usual refreshing swim. Nobody told us that the lagoon water might be contaminated with alpha particles. Nobody told the young men who were sent aboard the target ships to retrieve dead and dying experimental animals, cameras, and test equipment about the dangers of radiation. Why were some of the target ships quote-unquote decontaminated and declared Geiger sweet as opposed to Geiger sour when they were really not, so that the crews could go back aboard to resume their normal duties? We believe that this was experimental. Why do the surviving crew members of some of the support ships still refer to them as death ships? The bottom line is that they wanted to see how our ability to engage in combat operations during a nuclear war would be affected. They wanted to see how living aboard supposedly decontaminated target ships would affect our ability to perform our military duties. And we were also the victims of the insatiable curiosity of Dr. Strangeloves like Dr. Edward Teller, who wanted to see what could be learned from the testing of bombs of many different designs and yields. Just as John Deutsch lied on 60 Minutes the other night, Pentagon spokesmen have been lying for decades about the real effects of radiation on the hundreds of thousands of servicemen who were exposed. I rest my case.
Thank you, Mr. Rosen. We're